Hello, folks. This is Asif Rahmani. I just wanted to welcome you. Thank you very much for coming in. It's still a couple minutes remaining, so just wanted to welcome you, let you know we'll start in just a couple minutes. Recording started.
Well, welcome everyone. We're glad to get a little bit of time to share with you today. We're going to talk about working from home, and I think everybody in the world has to realize that the situation we're dealing with right now is not normal. It's difficult. We've got a lot of people that are having to work from situations that are not the best, but they're trying their best to get everything they can done. So that's what the purpose of our call today is, to try and share some points that we've learned, Asif and I, over the years of working remotely. Our company is completely remote, but we worked in places that are a blend of the two as well. We've got some things we've learned, but also some points that we've found from some very smart people at other organizations like Forbes and Bloomberg and LinkedIn Learning and Stanford and Harvard Business and things like that. Lots of those out there. I don't have my webcam on, do I? You are muted, Asif, it looks like.
Oh, sorry, I'm talking. See, this other thing. That's one of those things you got to talk about when you're working
That's
remotely.
right.
Muting, sharing video cams, issues like that. Yeah, there we go.
They are real issues, especially when you're not. I mean, we're used to it and we forget once in a while. So
yes,
it's one of those things that happens. We have to, when you're in a remote work situation, you have to learn to roll with the punches and help one another out. So that's really what it's all about. So let's go on to our first informational slide. This one is recognizing that today's situation is not normal, regardless of where you sit on the debate of work from home, whether you like it or don't. We have to acknowledge a couple of things. There are some things you can't control. You can't control whether there's a virus pandemic going on in the world that's causing safety concerns for the workplace. We can't control the situation people are having to work in from home, especially if they don't normally do it. They're probably home. Their spouse may be working from home as well. Their kids are likely home. There's lots of things that happen quickly in the situation we're in now. It's just not the best situation no matter where you're working from. Like the picture we've got on the slide at the moment was something that happened, I think it was this week, if I remember right. But Jimmy Fallon was interviewing Jennifer Garner from home, and one of his daughters came and interrupted him in the middle of it. So that kind of stuff happens. We have to learn to recognize what things are beyond our control and just move on. Help with each other, have a sense of humor, and help make the situation as good as we can. And that's what point number 2 is, recognizing what things we can do to minimize friction. Some of that is being patient and understanding with those that we're working with, and some of it is practical things we can do to set a good example or to make things work better for someone else. And that's what we want to focus on today. There's an awful lot of things we can't control in this situation, but there are some that we can. And really, your role could vary here. You think about it, you might be a leader of an organization. That will have a certain set of things you can and should control. You might be the leader of a team, a manager somewhere, and that again you have a certain collection of knobs and levers you can control with this situation. Or thirdly, you might just be an individual contributor, and there's a lot of things you can control to try and make the situation as reasonable as possible for those that you're working with. So let's jump into those a little bit. We don't want to spend a lot of time up front. We want to get into some of the helpful things. Let's focus on that first role. What if you're a leader in an organization? There are really 4 basic principles that Asif and I think are important on here. First of all, is working from home is not just a reaction. There is a business case for it. Now, I'm not saying this is a business case you might normally follow. Maybe as your organization that you're leading, maybe you don't think work from home is a great idea for a lot of your workers. But right now, maybe you think it is because of the situation we're in. So focus on the business case you have. There are things that are good about this, and focus on those positive things, the reasons why you're doing it instead of the negatives. Focus on the fact that you're keeping your employees safe. Focus on the fact that you probably are cutting some costs at your office at the moment, as you don't have to keep everything up and running if everyone's working remotely. Focus on the fact that you're building a sense of loyalty and community where you've got your employees' best interest at heart, and you're showing that in very tangible ways. There are some good things here, and the return on investment can be significant. As an example, Laurel Farrer from Forbes said that we should make an educated and intentional decision about how telecommuting will impact your business. Research the processes, understand the benefits you can expect, and then notice the figure she pulls here is even for a part-time employee, you could save $11,000, over a longer period. I believe this is for a year. I'd have to look back at her quote, but that's a significant amount of money per employee, and that's for a part-time employee. So there is quite a bit you can do to stay positive as a leader of an organization. And when you stay positive, it helps you make decisions that are actually helpful for the people involved instead of only grudgingly. So that kind of leads into the second point here, which is setting reasonable expectations. And the idea here is to provide some consistency and flexibility. At first, it might sound like those terms are completely opposed to each other, but here's what we're talking about by consistent flexibility. In some organizations, the leadership doesn't really take a positive stand in this. And as a result, it boils down to the individual managers, and many of them will just fall back on whatever their instincts are. So some of them will be very flexible and reasonable with work from home, and others will be very strict. There's some horror stories out there you can read online. I won't go into them here, but about draconian things that some people do just by instinct, by reflex. So as a leader of an organization, you can do a lot to set reasonable expectations consistently across your organization, realizing that we need to prioritize flexibility. Here's a good example of that. This is Catherine Mayer from Wikimedia, the company behind Wikipedia. They made an interesting decision where she set the expectation and communicated it across the company that they really only expected people to be able to work about half of their normal schedule through this crisis. That was a pretty dramatic statement, I thought, to just set the expectation that we know you've got difficult circumstances and we're not going to get a normal workday from you in these. But setting that expectation kind of takes the pressure off people and allows people to try and do the right thing. And that's interesting what she said in this is that recognizing what we're dealing with, we all have loved ones who need care, groceries that need purchasing, doctor's appointments, neighbors that need a phone call. But the key point there was we trust our colleagues. People will work when they can, and when they can't, we trust they'll be right. So she wasn't going to micromanage. I know you had a good point. We were talking about this earlier in our discussion, Asif, about micromanaging.
Well, micromanaging never works. It never has. I don't think it ever will. It just gets you small peaks when you do that. You push somebody's button, they actually get that done, but they're not happy about it. But setting expectations, which is, I know, easier to do when you're in front of a person, it's harder to do when you're doing it remotely, but regardless, setting expectations and keeping people accountable, keeping yourself accountable is where it truly, truly pays off for the long run. As Eric has been saying, we work from home also, so a lot of things have not changed for us because we've done that before as well. Keeping that mindset in your day-to-day state, day-to-day work as to what my expectations are for myself, what my expectations are from my colleagues and from my boss is super important, but it's hard to do. But yeah, coming back to what you were saying, the micromanagement of people, of teams has never worked and never will. You have to you have to set goals and keep to those and keep expectations in your mind very solid.
Yeah, focus on the outcomes. What's important? What are the priorities? And set goals and communicate well, and let people know that you trust them. That builds a lot of goodwill. Taking into account and prioritizing the safety of your employees and being understanding with the difficult situation they're facing, each and every one of them, builds a lot of goodwill. You're probably going to get people to go the extra mile when you do things like that. If not, then maybe you've made some poor decisions in the past about who you're hiring, but most people will try to do the right thing, especially when it's clear that you're trying to do the right thing for them.
Having
That
said
being
that,
said, you can,
oops, sorry,
go
go
ahead.
ahead. I was going to say that one of the things that we were talking about before, it is true that people will do the right thing, but always encouragement and nudging the right direction helps as well. Something, for example, my own mindset when it changed back when I started working from home a lot was the ability to go to work. How you go to work without going to work. That means dressing up, maybe taking a shower, keeping track of your hygiene, and not just falling into a rut of staying on the sofa and working. You want to be in the office or some, at least as much as you can control. And that mindset change helps a lot when you're actually going to work instead of having everything just meld in, where you don't know if you're working or you're with your kids or uh, that mindset change and having that focus makes a big difference, at least in my humble opinion.
Yeah, it does. There's some raging debates online, about people and which side of the fence they fall on that. But there is some definite psychological factors that work better if you do that go to work thing. Even if your work is at home, you keep a schedule as normal as possible. If you've got um, well, we'll talk more about some of those in a little later, some guidance from places like Bloomberg and some of those that we're talking about some of these. But yeah, you can establish some basic guidance for meetings and recognizing that there's more than one right way to do things, but figuring out what makes the most sense for your culture in your organization, um, and setting some reasonable guidelines for that help to get people through this. Also, in many cases, right now, this situation, organizations aren't talking about working from home permanently. They're talking about for however long it takes to get through this crisis. The majority or all of their people are working remotely. So you might approach it a little differently than you would an organization that is like ours, that's decided that we're just going to be completely remote. Um, Forever is a hard word, but that's our current situation. We don't have any plans to change. But some basic guidance for things like meetings. You could set some expectations that people use video when they can. But again, that idea of flexibility, realize that they may have a Wi-Fi network that's strained and taxed. So using video might make meetings impossible. Okay? So flexibility, but guidance, best practices. Using headsets. I know that's something, Asif, you talked about in our company.
Yeah.
We talked about it. Set the expectation that you will have a headset when you're going to be on a meeting, because it makes such a huge difference in how the meeting goes. You have to decide in your organization if things like what you're dressed in, if you still dress like you go to the office, or on the other end of the spectrum, pajamas are okay, probably somewhere in the middle for most organizations. But figure out what those are and establish some guidance so that there's some consistency in your organization. It'll help to avoid hard feelings and differences in what's allowed. Another thing that we thought was important um, for people in this leadership role in an organization is to find a way to deliver communications and announcements to people, no matter where they're working, in context of where they're working. So instead of falling back on email, that's everybody's subconscious instinct, right? We got something to communicate to all of our employees, send an email out to everyone. Well, even in good times, you get, I don't know, maybe a 20% read rate on most bulk emails you'd send out. Do you think that gets better or worse, Asif, when all of a sudden everybody's working remotely? What's your gut instinct on that?
Well, it reminds me of the movie, was it, oh my God, Office Space? No, Office Space, right? When you can actually go to someone's cubicle and say, hey, did you see my memo? Did you see my email? You can't do that. And email, I don't know about you guys, but I look at email as something that other people are putting on my task list. It's not my
Yeah,
task list, it's someone else is putting on my task list. So at some moment, some place in time, I get so much so that I just stop looking at it. But what if there was something super important that I needed to look at? What do? You can't go to their cubicle or to their office. So you have to be where they already are. And I think that's what you're talking about, Eric, where you have an actual pop-up or something like that appear where they are working,
right.
whether it's OneDrive or Teams or something in there, and in their flow of work, as they call it. Not interrupting it, but informing what they need to know within their flow of work is super important.
It is. It is. And you got to have some way to get those important things rise out of the clutter. One thing I've noticed is when, as a team or as an organization, you go remote, the amount of email grows like crazy, because people send an email for something they would have just popped their head over the cubicle wall and said, they're just teasing one another. There's really not even a question involved. It's just some little snarky remark that, friends do with each other. They'll do that in email now. So where you might have had 15 or 50 emails in your inbox when you get back from lunch, now that might be 150 emails when you get back from lunch. It snowballs like you wouldn't believe. So you got to find some way to communicate with people outside of email, and being able to do that is important. I know something we're doing to try and help is we're offering a free subscription for a limited set of functionality in our product that allows you to deliver those kind of pop-up communication messages to people. And that would be good, especially if your office, some of them are in the office and some of them are remote. It doesn't matter. If they're using these tools, they automatically get these communications. We think that's going to be a really important point for a lot of organizations, because email will get consistently less effective the longer people are remote. That's something we can post a link for if anybody's interested in seeing, because it's a free offer we're doing just to try and be helpful.
Yeah, and if the time allows, I can even show it as well. I have it running here of how it works and what the actual implementation is. But I'll put the link to this right now in the GoToMeeting.
Nice, nice. And too, after we're done, we're going to post an article that has a lot of these details and things in it too, and we can have links in that as well. But yeah, if that's helpful, we can post the link. All right, let's move on. Number 3, if you're leading an organization, is providing the optimal tools for the job. One of the mistaken conclusions that a lot of people draw if they've not been a remote working person before is to think that there's really no difference in how work runs. It's just a matter of where you sit, right? So you send all your people to sit at a desk at home, we can still do everything the way we did when we were in the office. And it just doesn't work the same way. The same habits and tools that you're used to using in the office become a bit more painful when you're doing them all remotely. So there's a different way of working, and we need to acknowledge that, especially when people are working from home with difficult circumstances, conflicting bandwidth requirements from spouses and kids, quiet areas that may be difficult. So try not to force people into the same tools they would have used otherwise. For instance, sometimes the tendency is to just think, well, everybody will just make a VPN connection and do everything normally, still do everything in email. We already talked about how email snowballs in a remote scenario to a point where it's just not effective anymore. But try to get away from those ways of looking at it. Now is a perfect situation for you to roll out some of these tools that you may have been tentative on before because you didn't see a clear use case, something like Slack or Teams or something like that. These kind of modern tools for file sharing and team collaboration are tailor-made for a remote environment. So I would encourage you, if you had this in your roadmap, it was just off down the road a little bit, or you weren't quite sure if you needed it or not, now is the time for you to make it available and see if it can get some traction, because it's the perfect scenario to encourage your users to get some benefit from these things. There are some things you can do depending on what tool we're talking about here to set certain configuration options to avoid some common problems. You want to, for instance, if you're using Teams or Slack, you would want to pre-create some teams or some channels for these people based on your organizational groups, the people that are working together, maybe also on your project groups that are cross teams. Do that, but also don't assume that you know all of the buckets that people work in. There's going to be lots of these informal groups that cross teams that you may not think of. So let users create new teams or new Slack channels, or make it easy for them to request new ones, so that you can help people actually cluster together in some of these team collaboration tools and accelerate the work that they're doing remotely. If you go with those old school things, if you make people do a VPN for everything, yes, it's more secure, but realize not everything people are doing needs that same level of security. And it really puts handcuffs on your users for what device they can work from, for how many steps they have to do to get through something. And that can be a big deal. Like, for instance, if your work computer has a very poor webcam, that's going to make the meeting experience very difficult for people. Or if the Bluetooth doesn't work well on a work laptop, but they can do it on a phone or on another device or something, those are reasonable reasons for people to do something outside of a work computer. So realize that sometimes people have to improvise a bit when they're home, and give them some ways where some things don't have to be as secure. I mean, the same thing happens in other parts of our life, right? We don't take our family treasures and lock them up the same way we store our butter in the refrigerator, right? We don't do retinal scanning and combination locks in our refrigerator for our food. There are some things that just don't require the extra layers of encryption and security and things like that. So try to be reasonable with it, and leverage some of these modern tools. Number 4 here is reducing the work from home and the new tool friction. That should really be the goal for any role in this particular environment, is reducing friction. So there's lots of ways to do that. You know, from the leadership perspective, encourage all levels of management in your organization to use whatever new tool you've chosen to roll out, to use some of the new habits. We're going to talk more about those in the manager and individual section, but encourage them to do these things. Have them start communicating to the people that report to them using these other methods. And it will really help set a tone and make it a positive experience instead of one where they get mixed messages. Another thing is, this is another in context place to be helpful. So we talked about our tool as a way to do bulk announcements. You can also start to communicate and announce and guide people. What are the best practices? What are the expectations for them? Tips on how to use the tools you've chosen to put out. Those can all be delivered in context as well. So keep that in mind.
I'll throw one thing in there, by the way, that's not very obvious. You mentioned regarding meetings before. One thing that I actually saw play out right in front of me is those of you who know Microsoft culture, you know that they have lots and lots and lots of meetings all day long. And I've not been a Microsoft employee, but you can almost say that I've been a Microsoft employee because I've worked with Microsoft for such a long time. And I saw the behavior, excuse me, before you had meetings and after meeting, but in between the meeting, you go to the bathroom, or once you come into the meeting, you have a couple minutes of regular chatter before you start the next meeting. Once Microsoft started switching it in the beginning to back-to-back meetings online, you didn't get that downtime. There was no time for bio break. There was no time for the small chit chat because you had to jump in and be ready. And people started complaining like, hey, this is not going to work. Microsoft actually went ahead and put out a guide eventually for internally, and then also afterwards externally to customers, calling out that specific thing that you have to think about it. One of the ways around it is you have your meetings end 5 minutes early. So it's 1 p.m. to 1:55 p.m. instead of 2 p.m. Such a small thing, but makes a big difference in a whole scheme of things, especially when you have back-to-back meetings that you can't control. Just wanted to call that out. Thought of that example. It's a very real situation that happened with a big organization like Microsoft, and they dealt with it.
That's a really good point. One thing I've noticed myself is that in a remote meeting, people get antsy 1 or 2 minutes into the time if people haven't shown up yet. Rarely would people get antsy 1 or 2 minutes in if they're sitting in a conference room somewhere, because there's this subconscious assumption that people are having to walk to get there, that they may have had another meeting in another room somewhere. People don't get that level of flexibility many times in a virtual meeting, and you still need it. Like you mentioned, there's, even if you're taking all of your meetings at your desk, there is the back and forth, or the fact that there are those one in a million, once in a lifetime situations where a meeting goes 2 minutes over, right? It happens all the time, right? It's not a unique thing to remote, but we have to remember to give people that same flexibility, create that culture. Let's talk about team leaders, managers. There's some things you can do as well, and some of these things that we talked about briefly at the leader level, at a manager level, we're going to talk about and build on those things. But here are the principles you need to think about. Number 1 is being willing to change the way you and your team work together. There's an organization called GitLab that writes a lot on how organizations can make this switch to remote work. And one of the things one of the pitfalls is people thinking that working at home is the same as working in the office. It's just not. And the quicker you can make an adjustment to what is the normal operation for your team, then the easier this gets, and the more pressure it takes off of your team, and the more productive you can be working in this situation. So as an example of that, we talked about email earlier. Email snowballs in remote scenarios. It builds and builds and builds to the fact where it becomes a force of nature, like the erosion of wind and rain. You need to find other ways to do your internal communications. So one example, we talked about Teams or Slack when we were talking about the leadership level, and the same thing's true in your team. If this is an option for you, encourage your team to do it. There's some good reasons to communicate this way. Yeah, it's whereas an email, everything goes into your inbox and it's just this big long pile of unread things to go through. In something like Teams or Channel, the conversations happen based in different topical areas, different channels that are created there. So you can focus on the ones that are important for you to contribute in. There's lots of things you get in mail that's just FYI. There's really nothing you need to do. In fact, there may not even be anything you really need to know at the moment, just somebody wanted to make sure you're in the loop for it. Or it's social conversation that if you weren't in it to begin with, you really don't need to be in the rest of it either. So if you start communicating in these team-based channels, you have a place where everybody can feel connected in the places that they're most interested, but they can also focus and really prioritize those conversations, those internal messaging. So little things like that can make a big difference in that. Getting things out of email and simplifying communication is one of the key benefits to a tool like Slack or Teams. It can really help in those situations. And you may not have noticed it if you were all working together in the office, but you're likely to notice it very quickly if you're working remotely. Another thing to think about is your schedules. Schedules are harder to synchronize between team members in a situation like this. Remember, somebody that's working from home and their spouse is and their kids are, they may have to work slightly different hours than they would have normally. They may have to take turns doing meetings so that they're not soaking up all their Wi-Fi at the same time. They may have to juggle lots of things. So if you can try to merge a complicated meeting schedule into something simpler, it's a really good idea. It's good to have some kind of regular meetings so people remain connected. They have a chance to see each other on the video feed and actually talk instead of just type. But realize you may have to make things simpler. One of the things I know we did not too long ago is we started doing daily stand-up meetings, and it really released us from the need to have all those random scattered status update meetings on things. We didn't need that. There was a time every day where we could be in, and it really simplified the schedule quite a bit for us to do that. So consider doing something like that because it may make things a lot easier. There's one time everybody can be online, and maybe that reduces the need for everybody to be synchronize quite as much of their day. Another one would be the information sprawl and the conversation sprawl. That's hard too. I remember we said this, but where was it? And you're looking in email and you're looking in Skype and you're looking in Teams, try to avoid as much of that as possible. Pick a way to communicate as a team and try to stick to that. Again, I would encourage that to not be email because it gets so hard to keep track of. And chaotic too, right? You get some people that reply and other people that reply all. It's a mess, right? But I would say that when you're working remotely, that chaotic feel that you get from 1,000 different tools and repositories is even worse when you're working remote. It just is. You're interacting with everything at work through a screen, right? And when it feels like things are scattered all over the place in there, you don't have anything that feels more human. So I would really suggest you find a way to streamline this. And tools like Team or Slack are a great way to do that because you can do so many things in that one tool. Really nice.
Absolutely. And I'm glad you mentioned Teams or Slack. None of us are Microsoft employees. Teams definitely is our preference and we use on a regular basis, but you do what you do, you use what you use. Slack is a great product. There's other products like Teams or Slack as well, whatever makes sense for you. You have to kind of almost go with the flow as to what your people are already getting value from instead of trying to squeeze them into something that they don't understand. That flow of work is super important. It reduces the resistance you're going to get. There's already this change in behavior working from home, and now you have to push other stuff down their throat with other software. That doesn't work, at least not in my experience.
Yeah, it's true. You got to figure out what's the least amount of friction, what's the least amount of disruption. And generally speaking, whether you're a leader of the organization, an executive or an IT, whatever it is, or you're a manager of people, people don't care usually about features and products and tools. They care about pain points, right? There's going to be a unique set of pain points working remotely that they may not be used to. So it's potentially a good opportunity for you to try something new, but yeah, pick what makes sense. Don't force things. Pick what's the least amount of friction and disruption. This is a difficult scenario. Make it better for the people that work for you and with you any way you can. Another piece of this is number 2. Once you've kind of decided what changes make sense model that behavior yourself. Make the changes yourself. So if you decide to use something like Teams or like Slack, then you start doing it. Reach out to people on there. The easiest thing for people to adapt to is to use Teams or Slack like they would have used Skype previously, right? One-on-one chat. You can do that in those things, but help them slowly to make a change to communicating in a team board. You do that, because a lot of the things you say are going to be something that's relevant for the whole team. So you start posting them that way. That's where it can really help to reduce the amount of internal email you're getting, is when you start doing those team-based things together in a board, and it can make a big difference. You kind of model that behavior.
I know some organizations where the CEO, or at least a CXO, someone in the C executive suite, gets involved and does a video call out. So when you come to the intranet the next time, a video come up, it's a video message from the CEO or from someone who you want to hear from on a regular basis. And these times, more than ever, I think that kind of stuff is super important. So going back to, as you were saying, the leaders do have to get in and model that behavior and say, you know what, we're in it here as well. We're here with you, and showing it with their face, their video. What we're doing right now, the reason we shared video is super important. It's super important to see who is behind the words that are coming out, because that makes it just much more real.
It is. It is. I mean, you think about, most of human communication is not the spoken word. It's the body language, it's the facial expression, it's the posture, it's that. And you don't even think actively about it usually when you're in a conference room with people, but you can tell if somebody's bored. You can tell if somebody disagrees. You can tell if there's tension. You can see that. You may not, consciously think about it a lot, but you can see that and you respond differently. So the things like video make a big difference. And the more you can model that behavior, the more you can encourage people to do it and set a good example for it, and recognize that there may be some reasons somebody can't do it. Maybe, but try to encourage that. It really does help. Things that you do, if you document review is something a lot of teams do. Come up with a way that's easy to do that. And again, team products like Teams and like Slack make this really easy to do. I mean, we're a big fan of Teams internally. We use that one instead. I use Slack with some other things that I do personally. But there are some really nice things you can do here that almost feel like you're sitting in a room working on this together, right? So you can really make things easier if you just give people examples of, this is an easier way to do things. And be considerate. It's just that. Be kind. That's a change you can model as well. Being understanding when somebody's dealing with, when Jimmy Fallon's daughter comes and interrupts him in the interview. That kind of stuff is going to happen. It just is. People are working in situations that were not prepared for this. They're doing the best they can. So be considerate, and that tone will carry through.
And I'll throw something else in there as well, something that I talk about in my conference sessions all the time. Many of us who are in the change management industry right now, if we came from a technical background like I did, I feel like I was a technologist, and now I'm more of a psychologist. And a part of being that psychologist is you have to empathize with people. You have to understand what they're going through and empathize and get in sync. It's like that wave that's in their brain. You got to get in sync with that. Because if you don't get in sync with that, then no matter what you say is going to go above their head or on the side or somewhere. Once you're in sync, then they'll start listening. For that, empathy is super important. Even though it's not technology specific, it's not software specific, you got to empathize, and then you got to communicate, not the other way around. It doesn't work the other way around.
It's true. It gets back to those core principles we talked about at the beginning, right? There are things you cannot control. So recognize that and do what you can to make things better. Right? That understanding, that empathy does a lot to make things better. Number 3 here is deliberately connecting with each other. As a manager, you have a lot of control over that. Here's an interesting thing that came from Bloomberg. Bloomberg, and we're talking specifically about the journalism portion of that organization. They had a bunch of journalists that were working in China and Hong Kong when all of this blew up. to do that. So all of them suddenly had to go, these are extroverted people for the most part that really thrive on social connection, and their job is all about going and talking to people for the most part, that and then writing what they learned. So all those people had to make adjustments very quickly in order to get their work done with remote tools. So one of the things that they mentioned was deliberately connecting with each other. You know, it used to be that they would go and they had an office where they could go and talk to each other and just be humans with each other. And all of a sudden they didn't have that anymore. Your team is going to be dealing with that too. So notice what they said here. After about 3 weeks of this going on, a manager helped to moderate a video chat for 20 people on their team where they didn't talk about work. It wasn't what it was about. You know, they talked about, you know, what is their work from home situation, and, you know, laughed about funny stories about it and their pets and their families. You know, some even had their kids come on camera on purpose, which is a welcome change, right? So they just connected as human beings. Now, obviously, you can't do this all the time, but it's important to have something like that. And if you can encourage that, you would probably do that if you were in the office, right? You might have informal arrangements, or you may even arrange times once in a while to do that. I can remember the last corporate spot I was in at Visa, my manager was good about coming up with team building events once in a while. Don't forget those things when you're working remotely. There's certainly ways to do that, to encourage people, you know, on a Friday afternoon or whatever, just to get together and relax with each other and just talk like you would in the break room about things. It's important because that's something that a lot of people that don't work remotely normally, some people wish they could, and some people hate it. You know, they hate it even just doing it for a day, because they really crave that social interaction, that face-to-face time with people. So you got to make arrangements for that. You got to help a team stay connected.
You know, a big part about all this stuff is I think people forget that this is not a regular, typical work from home situation. This
Right.
is a work from home with your kids situation if you have that. You know, so with the
Yeah.
other, your spouse, your kids, everybody's home for the most part for many of us. That's a very difficult and different situation. You can't even go to a cafe or library in many places where they're closed, obviously.
Yeah.
So you got to take everything into consideration, not just that, well, this is a work from home situation. It's not really. It's very different times.
It is. It is. And in fact, some work from home advocates out there that normally are, yes, everyone should work from home, are actually trying to temper expectations at the moment, because
Yeah.
this is not a normal work from home situation. It's just not. It's a bad situation for everybody. And not only are the logistics difficult, it is stressful. You know, people are worried about their families, they're worried about their supplies, they're worried about their jobs, they're worried about paying their bills, they're worried about everything right now. So every little thing that we do to increase the friction and the pressure on people makes them less productive than they were before. It's just what it is. It's hard. All right, we have one more principle here for leading a team. Ask your team what they need to be productive. It kind of goes in that same idea that we were talking about a second ago, as empathy. Don't just assume that you know what your team needs to be successful. Ask them. Talk to them. Some teams need more meetings because they need that live interaction between them. Some teams will need less meetings because they're dealing with difficult situations, and every meeting is stressful and difficult, and, you know, going the extra mile to be on it because of the situation they're in. Know your team. Talk to them about these kind of things and ask them what they need to be successful. Not every team will need the same tools. We talk about teams in Slack a lot because we've seen how much they can help, but they may not match your team. So really think about that. Talk to people about what they need and be flexible, and realize that what they tell you they need is likely to change over time. If this situation becomes a longer term than what people expect at the moment, their needs are going to change for it. So be willing to revisit some of these decisions and be flexible. Okay. Communicate well. As a manager, again, you get to set the tone for that. When I first started working remotely full time, I was working for Visa at the time. And my manager was very good about having a one-on-one with me, you know, regularly, because, you know, we didn't get to see each other, and gave us a chance just to chat about what was going on, how things were really going. Some of that was about the work we were doing. Some of it was about the arrangement. Some of it was just as humans, you know, and it's important to do because that's how you find out what people need. It's a little bit of pride to assume that we just know what people need and what's going to make them be productive. We don't know. because we don't know what they're dealing with. All right, let's go to individual contributor. Just because of the size of populations, I would guess that most people on this call are probably fall into this category instead of the previous two. There's more individual contributors than there are managers or executives in the company. Right? So if you are an individual contributor, this may be the section you were waiting for, because this is what you can control. You can't control what tools your organization decides to use, what arrangements your manager puts together, but you can control what you do as an individual and try to make the situation better for yourself and for everyone you're working with. Okay. So let's talk about some of these. And this is ones where I think Asif and I have more of a personal connection to as well, because most of the time that we work, we're working as individuals rather than stopping and saying, I'm doing this on behalf of everyone, right? That's most of the interactions we have with people is attending a meeting, okay? Or something like that, or setting up our desk for our work from home. So it's very helpful to talk about some of these things. And item number one there is an important one, keeping a practical routine. You mentioned that concept of going to work even if you're not going anywhere, right? Here's a quote from Bloomberg, again, that group of journalists that suddenly had to work from home. They talked to try to keep some semblance of your original schedule if you can. So like if previously you had to be at your desk by 8 o'clock, you can't sleep till 7:59 and then stumble to your computer and turn it on. Guess what? You won't be productive. So some semblance of a routine, getting yourself up at a set time. Maybe it's getting yourself dressed. Not everybody agrees with that one, but it may make a big difference of kind of mentally setting it up as now I am going to work, right? Having a set place where you do this. So that's the stable workspace part of it, right? The second quote there was a different journalist that said she bought a small table and chair to sit at. The place where she was working from wasn't large enough to have a real home office, but she made a little place, even if it was in the middle of the room. She bought a little table and a chair and got a monitor and a mouse and a keyboard because it made a big difference. I think you and I would probably agree with pretty much all of that, right? If you're going to be at home for more than a couple of days, you want an actual mouse and keyboard. You want a second monitor for the same reason you want them in your office, right? Imagine if your boss told you at work, you cannot have a second monitor. You cannot have a mouse or a keyboard. How upset would you be? So don't tell yourself you can't have them, right? It's worth spending a little bit of money to do this. Finding some way to get these things, because if you've got a laptop and you spend the entire day hunched over using the built-in touchpad and the keyboard, it's not enjoyable. You will be uncomfortable. You will be less productive. So take some time to set that up. Plus, just having all that set up in a specific place, again, gives you that concept of now's the time when I go to work. And then at the end of the day, it's just important to say, okay, now's the time when I'm done with work. Okay? And you close up that little section and go on. That's one of the dangers of working from home, is that the lines get blurred. So managers are always worried that you're going to work less. Studies have shown that most people actually work a lot more because it's harder to shut things down and walk away. Right? You kind of feel like you're always at work at that point. So this is an important concept. Let's see, second, prioritize your connection with your team. Some of these we've kind of mentioned concepts before, but I know something you talked about a lot with us as we started to do this, as our remote team started to grow, is to be thoughtful when you're attending online meetings. Have a headset, hopefully a noise canceling headset. Okay?
Yeah.
Because there will be things going on, especially if you're working from home and that's not a normal thing. You don't have a dedicated home office. There's going to be stuff going on in the background that will distract you and distract everyone you're meeting with as well. So find ways to manage that. Have a headset. You can hear. If you have something with a boom like this one, in fact, I know we were talking about this before. You specifically chose this headset today, Asif. Why?
That's right. I have 3 different ones, and this is the best in terms of getting my voice to your ears, everybody, without any distraction, without any other things. I could use the other 2, but there's going to be some echo. The other one's going to have more echo. It gives me more comfort, but it gives you less comfort, and you got to balance that out.
Yep. And you may feel silly, like you're in a call center wearing something like this. It doesn't have to be one of these, by the way. There are some very nice wireless earbuds you can get that do a nice job with things, but what you need to be sensitive to this. The noisier your environment is you're working in, the more you're probably going to have to move to something more like this. You can get ones that are comfortable that you can wear for a long time, and comfort is important, but think about your team members and what situation you're creating for them. It makes a big difference. Another thing, one thing that a writer from Stanford University mentioned a few days ago was the importance of maintaining eye contact. Using your video is super important, but even beyond that, realize that your webcam is up here. It's not down here. Okay? So when you're talking to people in a meeting like this, try to come up with a way where you can keep your focus up here. I mean, if you have two monitors, there are going to be some times where you look on the other side. It's going to happen, and most people will understand that. But if you spend the whole time in every meeting looking down because this is where your notes are, your keyboard, or whatever it is, it's disruptive. It creates more of an impression when you're working remotely than it would if you were in the room together. So try to arrange things, even just finding some way to set up your notes or your calendar or something, and be conscious of where your webcam is so that you can spend a lot of time looking at each other. It helps a lot. Another thing is to stay muted. If you don't have something specific, you need to say stay muted. We've all had the horror stories where someone's attending a conference call and eating a bag of Doritos and not knowing they're not muted. That's right. We've had that. There's worse ones out there. If you Google a little bit, there's worse experiences than that, but avoid those. Stay muted. And I think one thing I try to do that I haven't really heard talked about a lot, but if there's a conversation happening in a group of people, and what I was going to say has already been said, I really don't need to unmute myself and say that again. It's not productive. It's not adding anything to the conversation, and everybody unmuting and saying the same thing over and over makes a long meeting turn longer, and those feel even longer when you're remote. So I think things like that can make a difference. Being considerate of the people that you're meeting with.
Yeah. I'll add a few small things which I know are obvious, but you can see the camera's right there. You can see I'm looking at it here, but when I'm looking at my screen, obviously I'm not looking at the camera. That makes a difference. You have to do both at times. And the way the camera is angled also makes a difference. You can go like that or go like this, looking at my belly. You don't want to look at my belly, you want to look at my head and how it's positioned over here. But these things come with
Or
time.
you can do the infamous laptop on your lap where you're looking at people's nose
Yeah.
like that. That's a good
There
feel
are
too.
some laptops as well as some desktops which have a camera down there, unfortunately, and at the bottom. In fact, I do. Currently, the desktop I'm using has a built-in one down there, so I bought another one, a Logitech one that's up here. Makes it much better. And when you are sharing a video, especially when you're in a team meeting, the influence of what you're saying and how you're projecting yourself, that actually goes up automatically. You are more in the place and in the meeting than others who are not sharing webcam. Now, don't get me wrong, I don't share my webcam most, I shouldn't say most, but I don't share my webcam some of the times, but for good reason. But you want to balance that out, and where you really want to make a point and really truly be into the meeting and not just a bystander, you want to show your webcam. It makes a big difference.
It's true. It does. There are good reasons sometimes to not, but it's good to, as a rule of thumb, to do it more than not. It's a good thing with a remote team. Yeah, good points, all of them. Another one is just in conversations. So again, we're prioritizing your connection with your team. So this idea of using team channels and discussion boards and things like that is a big deal, because that little ping of the email all the time is very distracting, especially when the volume of email grows over time. And if you put things into team channels, again, the people that you're working with can pick which channels they need to focus on. So they can tune their notifications, and we're going to talk about that for yourself. You should tune your notifications so that you get the things that are most likely to be relevant for you, things that need action for you. It will really help you be more connected. You need to find a balance between feeling connected with all of your team versus not overwhelming them with too much. So most of these chat-based tools like Slack or like Teams allow you to @mention people. So if you're doing this, where you put things in multiple team boards and you're worried that you've got something really important you need to put in this team board, but you need to make sure somebody sees it, your instinct might be to fall back to email for that. I would encourage you, generally speaking, not to do that. Put it in the team board, but mention them. That way they're going to get a notification about it. So depending on how they set it up, they might get an email about it in case they're not watching, but they'll at least get notifications somewhere. It's a good way to get someone's attention if you're worried that they won't to do that. So anything you can do like that to kind of get conversations into a place that's topical, that's transparent, that way people can see the entire conversation if they need to. But they can pay attention and participate only where it's needed is really helpful. Item number 3 is discomfort and distraction. We talked about a comfortable noise canceling set of headset or earbuds. That's really important. Simple things like having good lighting where you're working makes a big difference in those video meetings. Having a comfortable chair to sit on. I got one of those weird kneeling chairs because my back gets sore a lot if I sit for a long time at a desk. But get something that makes sense for you. If your meeting software allows you to blur the background, do it. Even if you don't care about it, sometimes what's going on in the background of your living room or your kitchen can be very distracting for the rest of your team. So blur the background. It means you don't have to think about it and other people don't have to think about it. It just lets you focus on what's important in the meeting. Get up and walk regularly. If you have one of those, I have one of those desks where you can sit or stand, it'll lift up and down. If you can do that, great. If not, make sure you're getting up and walking around once in a while. It makes a big difference. It can be miserable to be strapped to your desk the entire day, whereas in the office you could have gotten up and walked around, and you would be even just doing your meetings. You'd walk from place to place, but make sure you do that in a while. Another place that comfort comes in is just your comfort level with the tools that you're working with. Try to get better with whatever tools you have to rely on. Chances are, if you don't work remotely normally, you just have a casual relationship with the tools that are necessary to do that. So increase your comfort level, learn something about that. Again, we have a free offer. Maybe your organization doesn't choose to use VisualSP as a software solution. You can still go get a free copy of it for yourself that may not give you all that communication stuff from the company, but it does give you little bite-sized tutorials about how to use these tools that you're in. If your company is using the Microsoft stack in Office 365 or in SharePoint, there's hundreds of tutorials that come from Microsoft that we make available in there for free for you. And it's right there in the tool. You don't have to leave what you're working on and go find an e-course and spend a half an hour watching something to get a single answer. You just click on the tab, get an answer about how to do a specific task that you're wondering about at the time. Do things like that to increase your comfort level and increase your skill. It will make things better. One last point here, again, in the idea of comfort level, is understanding how you can work across different devices. Most of the things you probably want to do with your main computer because many things will just work better there. But I would encourage you to set up the apps that you use for messaging and for collaboration, whether that's email, whether it's Skype, whether it's Chatter and Salesforce, whether it's Teams or Slack. Almost all of these have a mobile version of them. I would encourage you to set those up on your phone and maybe your tablets. Know how they work, how they're different from the desktop version, so that it's easy for you to quickly switch devices. Why? Well, again, think about what's happening in real life right now. You're working in a situation that's not perfect for things. And as a result, you sometimes have to change on the fly. Maybe all of a sudden your living room becomes a place you can't work because something else starts happening there when you're in the middle of a meeting. You need to quickly be able to switch over and use something else, go to the other room, go on the patio, or maybe just for your mental health, you need to go outside and work on the patio to get a little sunshine for a while. Be ready to do that. Have things set up and installed. Have a headset that you can quickly move from one to the other, whether that's Bluetooth or a corded one, whatever it is. And realize that even if it's not something you have to quickly do based on circumstances, there are some things that can very effectively be done from the couch or the patio. Change it up. You can review a document or do your daily email review or however often you do that. You can do that from a mobile device on the couch or on the patio and break up your day a bit. It can make a big difference. Any thoughts on some of these points, Asif?
You're making all the good points and taking a really nice, good breadth of it, so there's not much that I can add. Very true, though, that comfort level has to be there. for you to be productive. If you make it comfortable for yourself, it's going to feel good. And if it feels good, you're going to want to do it again. Once again, I'm talking like a psychologist here, but these things matter. And how you can quickly pick up your laptop or your desktop or your phone and get to do what you need to do. Digital literacy, is super important, especially nowadays. Super important to have become super comfortable with doing all these things.
It is. And having a comfort level and having some flexibility yourself on what device you use and where you do something can make a huge difference. Things happen, whether it's something that happens in the room behind you or something happens with your Wi-Fi connection and you suddenly have to switch to your phone where you have 4G, or there's 1,000 things that can happen. And if you have the ability to just switch gears and keep going, it's so much more productive and so much less stressful if you know you can do those things. So try to put forth a little bit of effort originally to get yourself set up and to understand how these things work in these other places. It makes a big difference. Yeah.
Absolutely.
I guess in just another big picture thing is that there are some warnings out there right now too from some of the experts about work from home and even just economic experts that are a little worried about the work from home experiment, both the process of going into it and the process of coming back out of it eventually. It's the idea of being flexible, being kind. Trying to recognize that there's not just one right way to do things. One of the concerns out there is that if everybody in the world decides to stop working from home and go back to the office, if every office, every organization decides to do that at the same time, that's very disruptive as well. So hopefully you can come up with a way to make this experiment a net positive. And by doing some of these things we've talked about, no matter what your role is, if you're the executive, the leader of the organization, your reasonable expectations and you're focusing on the positive and you're modeling good behavior, and being adaptable and changeable and using technology, you're making an example of those things, can make a big difference in how well this goes for your organization. If you're the manager, okay, the idea of asking people what they need and being as flexible as you can, and trying to make sure you maintain connections and maybe change the way you do your team messaging or change the way you do your meeting schedule or something. If you can find ways to make it more successful, people will be more productive. Okay? And you may find that ultimately some blend of in the office and out of the office is even more productive than doing one or the other. Many organizations find that. Even people that don't like one or the other, don't like coming to the office or don't like working from home, usually they can recognize there are advantages to both at times. So finding some way to make this through and realize that the situation that we're dealing with is likely to change over time too. It may be back and forth. If people go back to work, another wave of things happen and they have to work from home again. It's going to happen. So the more flexible we are, the more positive we are with things, the more successful we'll be, and the easier we'll be able to adapt to the situation as it changes.
Absolutely.
So, go ahead. Sorry.
No, sorry. I was going to ask that if we're at a good point, I can even show what we're talking about over here as to if somebody wants to take the next step and get the VisualSP for remote workers package, and how if we're able to help you guys show real-time messaging to yourself, to your workers, I can show you where the page is and how it looks.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Okay.
Yeah. I thought I would go through and look and see if there's any questions we have in here.
Yeah, I've been going through all the different questions
Okay.
as they've been coming in. Folks, if you do have other questions, even after the meeting, you're welcome to send it to us. You can just use a regular info@visualsp.com or just use one of our direct email addresses, eric@visualsp.com and asif, ASIF, @visualsp.com. Welcome email coming in as well. All right.
Yep, absolutely.
Let me go ahead and actually show this quickly here on my screen. Okay, should be able to see the Contoso screen, is that right?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. This is, and I already put this in the chat before as well, VisualSP for remote workers. When you do go to this page, it explains everything about the offer. It is a free offer currently. If you want to show announcements and inline help, video announcements like this that come up automatically to people within their own environment being any intranet browser, you can do that. It is for a limited time right now, but definitely reach out to us if this is helpful to you. This is what it would look like. So let's say in OneDrive, for example, a tab like this, announcements, and the tab name and all that stuff could be changed to, by the way. Could have communications, compliance information, notifications all right here. So HIPAA compliance, let me click on that. A walkthrough like this would come up where you can read the privacy rules, or you can click on I agree and be able to move forward. And everything is being recorded once I click on something as an employee, or agreement for uploading documents, filing my recommendations, message from CEO. Let's see if I have this. There we go. Something like that comes up automatically. A message from CEO that we were talking about before as well. Seeing the executives directly on your screen as you're actually in the work environment actually does help to understand what their messages are. Service interruption alert, all kinds of things like that could be done directly in the environment. It's all configurable easily as well by administrators to get the information out of the email inbox and directly into the environment where people are. So that was just a quick show. And once again, this is the page that you would go to. It's in the questions and answer panel and in the chat. So you can check that out if you like and let us know if we're able to help. Yeah. Eric, did you want to close out with some other thoughts?
Yeah, you might also show them the page if you're an individual contributor. You just want to download our Learning Paths product.
Sure.
It's all the free Microsoft help.
Good point. If you do
Even
a
if you don't
search
have,
for, yeah,
you may not have the authority to even get a free offer for your company or your organization, but you can do the thing for an individual.
yeah, absolutely. If you do a quick search for VisualSP plugin, Google, Bing, whatever, the first link that comes up is to download and install VisualSP. And this is the free extension, basically. Once you install the extension, it's right there, as you can see on the top right. The extension is running, and you'll see the help tab come up in your environment. And once it comes up, then you'll have all the information, all the how-to for all Office 365, even beyond Office 365 applications come up directly in context of your environment. So if you're in Word, you'll get Word training. If you're in Excel, you get Excel training, all coming directly from Microsoft through the VisualSP tab on your screen. In fact, I think I have one showing up over here. So yeah, here we go. I'm in Word right now. Here's the tab at the bottom right, and it shows all the Word-specific content that's coming from Microsoft right here. That's what the experience looks like, and you can get this going within a matter of a couple of minutes.
Yep, and really helpful to do something like that. I mean, you figure if you were in the office and doing this and you were stuck with something, you might ask real quick across the aisle, do you know how to do this? Right? And maybe they do, and maybe they don't. But even if they don't, you can still find answers on Google, right? But how long do you think it takes you to find an answer on how to do a task in Google, right? Probably 20 minutes, probably, by the time you do it, because you have to search 2 or 3 times to come up with something that looks like the answer, and then you got to figure out, does that match my version? Is that even turned on in my environment? Do I have that? So if you can eliminate a lot of that and make it 1 or 2 clicks, you can come up with an answer for a task. That can save you a lot of time. That can make you more productive.
Absolutely.
Especially when you're having to rely on more technology than you might have normally just to do the logistics of your office.
Makes sense.
Okay. Well, thanks everybody. Thank you very much. Let's see. Oh, and somebody asked if we have VisualSP coming for Teams. Actually, it was
we already do.
We do.
Yeah, we already have. If you look for a VisualSP app in Microsoft Teams, you'll find VisualSP right there. In fact, I might have it running over here. Yeah. Here's what it would look like. So within Microsoft Teams, you would have the VisualSP on the side right here on the left rail. You would also have it as a tab that you can put in here. When you click on it, all VisualSP content, in this particular case, I think it's going to be all Learning Pathways, Microsoft Learning Pathways content that's going to show up in here. Here we go. Yeah, it's right there. Already available in the Teams App Store.
Good stuff. That's one we're excited about. It's probably I think it's our newest edition.
It is the newest edition, that's true.
Mm-hmm. Okay, well, thank you, everybody. Again, if you have questions or something, feel free to reach out. We're also going to post an article that has a lot of these points in it and some of the links to pull from in that as well for some of these, these 2 free offers, and maybe even some of the other articles that we found from Forbes and things like that talk about some of these work from home topics, try to give you a place to find all that information. So stay tuned, and thanks to everybody for your time.
Thanks for coming, everybody. Hope it was a good time spent for you, and let us know if there's any feedback. Thanks.